of community science from ASTC. And that bold part there on the screen is really the most important part about advancing community priorities. Community science does involve community members, often alongside professional scientists and science engagement practitioners, using science and technology to really make a meaningful difference on the ground in their communities. But the most central important part is that it's really focused on things that folks in the community really care about and are impactful in their lives. So zooming back out just a little bit, wanted to share a little bit about ASTC. Again, as we've said, we're a membership association of science centers, museums, botanic gardens, with more than 500 members all over the globe, mostly in North America, but with some folks in other countries. And our vision is to increase the understanding of and engagement with science and technology among all people, which is a shared vision with many of our members. So what we do to make that happen is to support our museum members and the entire science engagement field in doing this work that really connects people and the scientific process. As part of ASTC's Community Science Initiative, we're really focused on building capacity for this somewhat new way of working collaboratively in the community science space. So we do that through fellowship programs and funding opportunities that enable our members to do this work in their hometowns. We provide toolkits, guides, and other written resources that folks can refer to and use to inform their own work. We also provide networking opportunities and peer-to-peer support to build a professional community that's really focused on this work. And we also provide training and professional development. So we talk about the basics of community science. We talk about some of the approaches to community science, and we offer these in order to help, again, build this common understanding of this really community-focused, highly collaborative way of working that is sometimes very different from the way many science engagement professionals work, where they are positioned as the expert with knowledge that they know how to filter down. This is flipping that model a little bit so that we're helping our members build those active listening skills and attention to equity in their conversations so that they feel more comfortable working in partnership. So before I go back, I also just wanted to flag, Kristan is on this slide here in this photo. She was one of our Dialogue and Deliberation Fellows, which was just one of those professional development opportunities that we provide to our members. So, why participate in community science? For our Science Center and museum members, this is a practice that is really well aligned with those visions and missions that we touched on a little bit. It can advance lifelong science learning. It connects science and society. It engages really diverse audiences very intentionally. And this is a way to help generate new innovative solutions to local and global challenges. So all of these practices through the community science lens help those science centers and museums do their work really in this close partnership. Why are communities participating? Well, it can enhance individual and community level scientific agency. And we use this term agency rather than literacy because we're really placing the focus on the ability of people, individual human beings, to leverage science and technology, use scientific methods and understanding in order to make decisions in their own lives. Community science can also inform new research agendas and questions. When you ask a broad group of people, what matters to you? What information do you need? That can often lead to new and innovative questions and ways of approaching research and experimentation from those perspectives outside of the mainstream academic field. Community science also connects local context to scientific and technological process, showing communities how they are not separate from, but really a part of the scientific enterprise and the positive impacts that can have in their community. And last but certainly not least, involving community members in scientific research and collaborative processes can inform those moral and ethical guidelines for research and the application of technology. If you don't ask people what matters to them, it's really hard to include them in ways that are accessible, useful, and equitable. So again, why are science centers and museums in a good position to do this type of bridging work? Well, science centers are often one of the most trusted sources for scientific information and have a lot of power as these place based institutions to be trusted conveners and community spaces where folks can come together in pursuit of those shared goals. So, oftentimes, museum and science centers are already really well known establishments within their community and have this space are operate as a third space where folks can come together in conversation. And museums also just have a lot of tangible assets, like their museum space, like a lot of lab equipment, and intangible assets, like all of the expertise that their staff members hold in research, in community outreach, in communications, in order to support community based work. All right, so one more definition for you. We've been saying communities, communities, hometowns. What does that actually mean? Uh, when we talk about communities, we encourage folks to be really specific about the community that you want to work with. But communities broadly are a group of people that share something in common, whether that is a common location or jurisdiction, common characteristics or interests. It's not necessarily a zip code or a racial or ethnic group. There's many different ways community can come together and be formed. So we encourage you to be specific when you think about who am I reaching out to and seeking partnership with, but also who are all of the sub communities in my community that I see myself as a part of. Uh, Also, just want to share this other resource from ASTC that helps put together all of these pieces of information that we've gathered. This community science framework was based on a literature review and interview series that our organization conducted in 2021, bringing together information, case studies, insights from a wide variety of professional practices and disciplines that all sort of exist at this intersection of collaboration, community, and science. So you can see on the left-hand side of the diagram in blue, we have approaches to community science. These are common ways of working or methodologies that we use to loosely group the types of activities that might constitute community science. And today we're going to dig into that first approach listed, dialogue and deliberation. Also on the slide here, you can see we have some common attributes and common outcomes of community science. And the first thing I want to say is that this is not a checklist. You do not need to have every single attribute and every single outcome in order to be considered doing community science. But we share this as a way to show you what are those common qualities that make successful, authentic, equitable community science partnerships happen, which are centering community priorities, respecting community strengths, sharing leadership, and so on, as well as the outcomes that you can expect from these type of processes, which again might include increased science agency, like I touched on earlier. It might also include ethical decision making, gathering more perspectives and more information in order to make ethical decisions. They often also result in sustainable solutions for society. So coming up with that new way of working that can really help protect against future harm or rectify past harm. All right, just couple more slides, and then I'll pass things over to Kristan, who will really dig more into dialogue in deliberation. I did want to break this out just a little bit for folks and flag that dialogue is really focused on listening and learning from one another about your perspective, your topic, and really doing that with openness and respect, seeking to find common ground, not to argue about who's right or to win a debate, but really to find those areas of commonality. Deliberation is builds on dialogue to examine and weigh options. So you might come to common ground on a particular decision. You might have more information to sort through other decisions. But deliberation is this process of really thoughtfully understand or assessing what perspectives are in the room, what information you have, what information you might still need, and where you think you are headed together. So, when we talk about dialogue and deliberation as an approach to community science, we're really talking about facilitated sessions that bring community members together in order to find that common ground, surface common priorities, to bring more voices and, importantly, more diverse voices to the table to be involved in conversations. It can break down barriers and power dynamics, especially if a science center or museum is facilitating a conversation where they're inviting folks from very different parts of the community. You might hold a session where you invite your local council members or lawmakers to listen to stories from local students and families who have a particular perspective on an issue that's up for consideration in your community. And again, ideally, dialogue and deliberation can help develop solutions that work for the majority of people. So, seeking common ground, seeking those actions that can be taken to advance community priorities, and trying to involve as many people as possible in those conversations in a facilitated way. So, a dialogue and deliberation session might involve developing recommendations and policy solutions, like, for example, the scenario I just described of having a conversation with lawmakers and families in the community. It might simply to be to increase understanding, to connect groups that might have been divided, whether that is through uh, power structures, through their interests not necessarily being clearly aligned, or whatever the case may be. And it can also be an opportunity to resolve conflicts when you bring folks together in a facilitated way to have these authentic, humble listening sessions. It can help bring out commonalities or common ground that you didn't see before. So, I will pass the microphone over to Kristan. Before we do, I just wanted to see if there are any clarifying questions about community science really broadly, about any of the specific information that I shared, or even about ASTC.
Fabulous. Thanks, Laura. And if you all have questions for Laura, Naomi, while I'm talking to, drop them in the chat. We can bring others back into this. I very much want to share the space. I'm Kristan Uhlenbrock. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. I just really want to acknowledge the work that Laura, Naomi, and the rest of our community science teammates do at ASTC. Really is thoughtful leadership. It's connecting many of us who do this work in communities across the country and beyond, and they provide great tools and resources and environments, and I've learned a ton from working with them over the years. Highly recommend checking out that dialogue and deliberation toolkit. There's a ton of great resources no matter where you're starting from. And thank them for kind of thinking of including me. This is, I think, the first time that ASTC and myself have presented together. But I'm going to kind of give you all a little bit about who the Institute is and some of the work that we do, and then talk a little bit about that project that Laura and Naomi were talking about, a deliberation and dialogue project that they helped support. And then I'll talk a little bit about misinformation. So I'm getting ready to share my screen. I would love for those of you who are tuning in to just maybe drop in the chat where you are. We'd love to know what sort of city, town, or if you're more comfortable state you're tuning in from. Just get a sense of who you all, where you're all located while I share my screen.
Looks like we have people from Denver, Ohio, Maryland, Salt Lake City, Indiana, Tallahassee, West Virginia, Georgia, Los Angeles, Michigan, so all across the country.
I love that. Thank you all for doing that. I am in Denver, and you all can see my screen. Is that correct? I'm seeing some nods. Fabulous. Okay. It's got like multiple screens open here. I'm working from home today, if you haven't figured that out. And so it's always a little bit of a different setup. So I have the pleasure of serving as the executive director for an entity called the Institute for Science and Policy. We are affiliated with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And what's great, again, like an organization like ASTC that represents science centers and natural history museums across the US, is that we all have some similarities, but we're also very quite unique. And we're very often seen as very place-based organizations. And so the work that I do at the Institute is very unique to not only our mission and vision and our community, but there's lots of other great museums and science centers who have various versions. But there's nothing exactly like what we have, which is really great. And so we're often sharing learnings that we have about the Institute. Also, here is my team. We are also a small and mighty team within the museum. We actually got launched and established in 2019. And so we've been growing this program for a little over the past 5 years since we've gotten started. And that's my amazing team. It definitely takes a village. So I'll talk about a little bit about the Institute. I'll talk a little bit about D&D, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the topic of misinformation and some thoughts I have about how I have brought lessons to thinking about engagement with members of a community. But the Institute really does sit at the intersection of where does science and evidence and data fit into our decision-making processes. I often like to say I work in a silent S for science and a small p for policy, because those are often not the two things that we're leading with or even the main drivers of a lot of conversations we have. We're often working at the intersection, which is people's values, people's belief systems, our challenges with our biases and how we come to these conversations as humans, and that it's important to bring in science and evidence and data into these conversations, as well with all of these ways of knowing our world. But that's often not what we're leading with. And that's often not where we're seeing disagreement and debates, and we're starting to have really true, deep, hard, either community-based conversations or even policy conversations. But that's what we try to do. We try to elevate that role within these conversations, but it takes a really bit of a different approach than I think some of us who come from the scientific community world and we're just like, here's all this great information and knowledge that we have, please take it and use it. And we know that's not how decision making works, nor should it work in a democracy. Great. So I focus predominantly in Colorado, and the state of Colorado is kind of where I draw a little bit of our boundary and borders to the type of work that we do. But anything that we work on often has either really local or global lens to it because it's all connected. So whether you're talking about working on a climate change or an energy related issue, something to deal with water, particularly if you're here in the West, public health, we really have these really interconnected issues along the way. And so those are kind of some of the issues that we work on as the Institute, a bunch of wicked problems where there are no easy answers. And then we have a lot of different types of audiences. And that's really critical and important, is that our work is meant to reach a lot of different people. And the types of things that we do will be targeted and tailored to very different audiences at times. Everything from community members, community leaders, other thought leaders, decision makers, our partners are very critical. And then just that science and curious public in general. So our approach over the past 5 years has evolved as we've been doing this work. It's a beauty to have an institution like a big museum or a science center really kind of come in and support creating something like an Institute for Science and Policy, to be affiliated with it, to be part of it, to be embedded, to be integrated with it. But that also means we didn't have a roadmap to how to do this work. And I come from this world a little bit, but I'd never done this work in a museum environment. And so it's been a learning experience for myself, as well as the team and my museum colleagues and peers, to really continue to make sure that we're evolving our model and our approach to what does it mean to engage in these conversations. And so this is just kind of that high level view of how I've defined the approach that we take. And this has really been informed by engaging with our community members, doing a lot of research, talking with people over the years to really hone in on where we're adding value to the conversation. So I like to say there's this overlapping Venn diagram to really describe the Institute, where we are trying to blend community engagement with kind of some aspects of what you would consider a traditional think tank. And that there's a really unique spot in between these two where we like to kind of position ourselves. And that's just kind of one working model for how to describe the work that we do at the Institute. But it is really about creating a very welcoming, inclusive place where people can come in and have very deliberative, difficult conversations and dialogue. Sometimes these are very much off the record conversations, so people can bring themselves fully to these problems to talk about the history, to talk about those power dynamics that Laura alluded to talk about where they disagree. And oftentimes we don't have those settings, particularly when you're thinking about the policymaking or decision-making process settings. And so we try to provide those opportunities at times. We also do this in a very public way as well, too, but we kind of do both sides of that. And then, like I said, we do try to center in both evidence, other ways of knowing into these conversations, and really start trying to focus in on where we're heading to solutions. And the biggest message I often take away for anything I do is it really is about relationships and building trust, which is important because that's what this community group is all about. Okay, last little bit about the Institute, and then I'll talk a little bit about dialogue and deliberation. But these are kind of the 3 pillars to the type of work that we do at the Institute. It is convening, it is getting people together in a space to have really sort of unique conversations and dialogue where we're talking about solutions, we're talking about pathways. We're not trying to convince people that this is the answer and this is the step you have to take, but sorting through where there are trade-offs, why there are trade-offs, where are there barriers for participation. Another part and critical part to what we view both the Institute and this work is storytelling. People really connect to challenges and issues and remember things through story. And so story is really critical to the work that we do. We have a podcast that's like a long form sort of documentary narrative podcast, but we do it through other ways as well too. And then the kind of third pillar to our toolbox is digging into that research. And this is more of an emerging area for the Institute. It's been the place that I've been eager to grow into that space. There's aspects that feel a little more traditional think tank-like, where we're starting to get in some of that really deep policy analysis work. But those are kind of the 3 pillars to what the Institute does. And often we're doing those 3 pillars in coordination around topics and issues as we go. I'm going to take a pause. Okay, cool. If you all have questions as I go, you're welcome to raise your hand and interrupt me. I'm happy to pause, or you can drop them in the chat. We'll definitely keep an eye on them. So I want to talk a little bit about this work that ASTC has been leading, and I had the privilege of being part of an amazing cohort of other members across our museums and science centers across the US who we all had really different ideas and projects, but it was done through this Deliberation and Dialogue Fellowship Program back in 2022 that Laura mentioned. And we all got amazing training and support amongst one another, as well as some outside folks coming in to really guide the work that we did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the project was that I did and how we kind of came about deciding to do it. So we were focused on one of the issues that the Institute works on, and I had been working on, is disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. We can talk a little bit about those definitions here in a minute. And how that has an impact not only on science, but on our communities. And one role and one of critical audience member, when you think about the role of misinformation, is the role of journalism and the role of having trusted sources that you would go to, whether that's your institution yourself as an individual, your institution, or it's the media. And so to me, that was kind of a really critical piece. I had some great partners here, and we decided we're going to talk about how do we tackle misinformation, disinformation in our communities, and start to bring together a number of partners that I'd already been working with where I knew there had started to been some work. And it's in essence, how do we get our audiences together to do this better together? So we did this with a group called the Colorado News Collaborative. And the CSU, Colorado State University Center for Public Deliberation. They were primarily a Martine Carcassonne, who leads that, has written books on deliberation and dialogue, and he's in our backyard. He kind of really helped us design the Institute from day one. And so he was a nice sort of facilitation partner to bring into this, who was bringing some really great skill set, because we had a pretty ambitious project where we wanted to train journalists on what does it mean to have really deep, facilitated, deliberative conversations, and to reimagine what does it mean to be a journalist in this day and age, where you are also a member of a community, where we know that distrust can happen when people don't trust their local community outlets and sources and news outlets. And that also you have a responsibility to be reflective of the issues of what's happening in your community, to be really attuned to what it is. And we're not solving the challenge of how media is funded and the challenges of declining a media landscape, but we are talking about a very specific piece in it. Because when we start thinking about how are we tackling and dealing with this misinformation that we see in society, it has a threat to trust. It has a threat to trust on our institutions. It has a threat to trust on the health of our democracy. And so CoLabs was kind of our primary partner. I had worked with them on a couple other things. And what they had been building over the past couple of years had been some community cohorts, really focused in on some racial demographics and representation that didn't exist and aren't well represented in the media landscape. And so they had 4 working groups that had just been starting to get off the ground. And these working groups had come up with some of their preliminary, like, this is the help that we need to start to build trust and try to work on that. And so we started working with them in these community groups and these working groups as a partnership. And we did a couple things. We trained journalists to be our facilitators. So we started with a really long course on facilitation. What does it mean to have deliberative dialogue? What does it mean to be a facilitator? And it's an art, it's not a science. And many of us on here may already be conveners and facilitators. And every time I do it, I am learning more and I'm improving. And it just takes a lot of work to try to do it well, where you really are trying to listen. You're trying to be that person where you're inspiring conversation, moving that conversation along. And then CSU was our partner, and they had students that we worked with as well as Martine Carcason. And what we ended up doing is we created 2 things. We created what is called a viewpoints document. And this is kind of a step 1 when you're thinking about trying to get a landscape assessment of what is the issue. Oftentimes, we are not even sometimes talking about the same thing. So it's really important to ask questions and define, what do we mean when we talk about misinformation? How are you defining the problem? And what's your value around that? And so through that, not only did we interview and survey work with the working groups, we did a much broader survey, and we came up with all these different viewpoints, and we call that a viewpoints doc. And I've got a link I'll share with you all later. And what it is, I think there's probably, a dozen or 16 different viewpoints in here about the impact of misinformation on X. Everything from, oh my goodness, it's the worst thing, it's going to blow apart our democracy, all the way to it's kind of overblown. Misinformation's always existed in our society, right? It's not really that big of an issue. But you have these really different viewpoints on it. And you can use that document to start a conversation. And that was the intent, is you would start a conversation with these folks where you had these viewpoints, and you'd be like, which one resonates with you? Why does that resonate with you? Which one do you disagree with? And so this is really important, is it's trying to set the baseline. The other thing that we created with this deliberation dialogue work in the sort of second tier evolution of working with these community groups was having materials that they could use. So this viewpoints document was something that they would be empowered to go use in their communities, was a discussion guide. And so this is the idea of how do you kind of train others to continue to carry on and go do this work. And the discussion guide is this sort of next step in deliberation. And what this is, it takes your viewpoints and then it starts to talk about pathways, options, and solutions of what you might want to consider as a community to try to start tackling and solving that problem. And so we work with these groups to kind of do that through that lens of misinformation. How does it show up in our communities? What's the role of media? What's the role of trusted institutions in that? And we have these 2 publicly available documents. They're both in English and Spanish. And then we have a cohort of 80-some people who are trained now across the state of Colorado, both in newsrooms and communities, to take this information with them and try to do that back in their community. So that was a little bit of the project. And now I kind of want to go into just a little bit more about the topic of misinformation and just share a little bit of how we were approaching it for the deliberation dialogue. Which is, and we heard a little bit of this from Laura too, but there were some key components to what our deliberative engagement looked like. And often these are kind of common in other sort of deliberative type engagement activities. And I think it's really useful to share this with you all as scientists and practitioners and others who are interested in this work, that there is all this pre-work that needs to go in. And there are some really great resources that exist to help guide you as you think about wanting to learn more. One of the critical pieces is there's aspects of just wanting to engage and have a conversation. What I'm talking about here is really deliberative engagement. And this is meant to advance conversation. So the framing is really critical here. It's helping people to understand competing values, arguments in public discourse. And that's what we mean by deliberative framing. Like, where is there tension? Where is there a challenge and an issue so that we can work through it? So you have to begin to understand that that's the framing you want to come in. And you have to be okay with conflict a little bit. You have to be okay in leaning into these hard conversations. We also need to consider that you have to have baseline information, backgrounds, framings, things like that to get people talking about the same thing. I think we would all not be surprised how often that we are talking past one another. And so as you're thinking about putting together deliver engagement, it really is thinking about trying to create some of that baseline knowledge so that people feel that they're starting from some sort of playing field where we all can kind of pick up a piece and start together. Smaller, diverse, representative groups, that's probably pretty common knowledge for us. It's really critical to think about that. These activities don't work well when it's groups of 300 people, right? A lot of our convening work is like 15 to 20 people in a room over 6 months, meeting again and again and again. And it is time consuming on all sides for people to show up and to participate. And you've got to consider, what does that mean for someone who takes that time out of their life to come do this work? Perhaps they are a community member who is working 2 jobs with kids at home and needs childcare, or you need to make sure you have food. And so there's these little things as you're thinking about convening and bringing people together that you've got to think holistically about that time commitment, but that is so critical to have that diversity representation in a room when you're working on with deliberative engagement. And really, it isn't about talking. I know I'm doing a lot of talking today in this sort of webinar, but most of this time, it is hardly much talking. It's really having thoughtful processes where people are actually engaging. You know, it is not about lecturing to people at all, ever. And it is really about getting them talking and sharing their perspectives. And I can't underscore and de-emphasize the role of facilitators in any of this. So I alluded to this just a little bit at the beginning, but just really clear, there's a lot of great examples out here. We often rely on first draft news for some really clear definitions of what does it mean. I use misinformation quite generally as a kind of bucket catch-all. Many of us do that, but there are differences between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, right? And so misinformation is like, oops, you know, didn't really know that was fake, inadvertently shared something. We do this all the time. Disinformation has a little intentionality to it, right? We do see this. We see this a lot sometimes in our social media. But it is that has an intentionality to deceive or mislead. Malinformation is intent to do harm. And that exists in our society. And that is a whole other category where you should have safety measures. You think about some of our social media categories and whatnot. Often we're working in that misinformation, disinformation space. But the reason why I define these, because it's important to think about the intent of when we're trying to talk about a problem, not only have working definitions, but what's the intent of what's happening behind these. And obviously this impact is quite problematic in our society. So when we think about the challenge of why misinformation, disinformation is a challenge in our society, it's because we're human and we've got these monkey brains. And we have these ways of viewing and operating and working through the world that makes us so messy. You know, we as humans know this a lot from some of our brain and social psychology sciences, is that we really want certainty about things. We really want consistency across things. It just makes life easier. We love this us versus them, good versus evil narrative, right? So these are things that you think about when you start thinking about why misinformation is prevalent and perhaps becoming more prevalent in some of our world. It's because it's starting to feed into things. Algorithms are starting to find these things that like just our little brains love to feed into. We like to gather with like-minded people, right? It's a little bit easier on us. And I know I'm talking, you know, a week or so. I don't know how many days this is now after an election right now. But this is just ongoing for all of us, which is how do we kind of get outside our own circles and really start to listen and connect with people where they are. And another challenge with our brains that we know in making this problem issue is that we love to filter and cherry pick, right? It is an evolutionary cycle for our brain to want to simplify things to support our worldviews. And I love this I did this in a different talk recently with a bunch of engineers, and I came across this data point, which I thought was fascinating, which is that in 2023, the average daily time spent, and this is all major media outlets, including TV, newspapers, etc., is we're engaging about 12 hours and 31 minutes with information, right? That number is increasing, right? So we're reading, we're on our websites, we're on our phones, these devices here all the time, right? We're getting information from so many different ways, just our connected world and how we engage this day and age. But the thing is that our brains can't take in that much information, right? Our brains are shown, I'm sorry, there's a car horn going off my window if you all hear that. We have all this information coming to our brains at any given minute, right? 11 million bits. But really, our brains can only process just a sliver of that, right? That is how our brains have meant to evolve. And the reason why I show statistics like this and some data is because it's not people are bad, right? We often want to be like, oh, that person, and there is bad actors out there. This isn't not to say that, but oftentimes we just have to know that this is the complexity in which we operate in when we're trying to tackle some of these really big problems like misinformation, right? And so because we have this, we have all these biases. I think there's 180 different cognitive biases. Some we're aware of, some we're not aware of, right? We've got like the availability bias where we know like what comes to mind most quickly is how we want to make a decision, right? That is a whole fascinating world to really try to understand. And to me, the point of all this is that we're just a biased species. And the minute we start recognizing that, that kind of takes that heat and level down from the type of conversation you're trying to have. But we also know there's some good things about us humans, right? And our brains and what we do. We are inherently social. And that means a lot of different things to different people. But in general, we are a pretty social species, and we are often looking for purpose and for community. We are empathetic. We can be pragmatic and creative. And we have this ability to build better habits and overcome, right? So as much as there's challenges with us as humans and our brain and what we have that really can be divisive, there are really things to lean into that make us a really great species. And I encourage us to think about how do we do that? And that's kind of the work that we do. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left. I wanted to tell a little bit of a story and give you all some next steps, but I'm going to take a quick pause, see if there's any quick questions right now. If not, I would love to share a story with you about trust. So I'll keep sharing a little bit of story, and then we'll have some more time here for any sort of open conversation. But this is an example last year of a group of folks. This is with the American Meteorological Society. So we've been doing some work on air quality and air pollution, which is a challenge for us here in Colorado, as well as other urban areas for a variety of reasons. Number of cars, just how our Front Range region of Colorado is designed with our upsloping mountains and weather patterns. And so the American Meteorological Society, which I'm a member of, and on one of their committees, had their annual meeting in Denver, and they reached out and said, we want to engage community. And they reached out to me and said, let's do it. And I was like, all right, let's kind of step back. What's step one here? Like, what's the intent? Why do we want to do it? Well, fast forward, to many, many months later, and I was hosting a convening. And so we had scientists in the room here. We had community members and community leaders, folks who have for the past, for decades and decades lived under a very heavily pollutant industrial site and dealing with some severe environmental justice issues around air pollution and air quality, both very localized and very passionate advocates about this issue, and rightfully so. We had members of our government, both city and state government in here, who do our air quality regulations and sit on commissions. So this is an example of one of these sort of like, off the record sort of conversations. But we took practices of community science, we took practices of deliberation and dialogue, and we had this very first meeting to try to just get people talking. And I'm at one of these tables and I'm facilitating a conversation between a community member. There's like 6 people at my table, including me. There's 2 researchers, 2 community leaders, and 2 members from government. And I'm facilitating a conversation between a community leader and a representative from our regulatory agency. And there is a lot of talking past one another. Well, we have made changes. You are not changing. We've made changes, sort of dialogue happening from one another that we're facilitating. And there's emotion involved, there's tears, right? There's passion. And everyone had to take a breath in a moment, right? In real time. And what I had observed happen in real time was that they were using different language. They were not listening. They were talking past one another. And that there's a history here of not having trust, right? Of not having good stewardship and engagement, particularly from the government side here, of thinking about what does it mean to be a community engagement, right? And next thing you know, half the table is just like sitting there quietly, watching this unfold in real time. We got through it. We worked through it. We started to kind of get those emotions out, let things calm down a little bit, and start really honing in, using very much deliberation dialogue practices on what it is that we want. And often what we found from my table conversation among many others here was we actually had a lot of alignment on what we wanted. And what I think that the conflict had been other things that had never had a chance to get voiced and concerned. It had been just been acknowledging the history, right? It had been acknowledging the history of exclusion, acknowledging the history of injustice that had happened in a community. And at the same time, this person is brand new leadership into the agency, and they've been there 3 years, and they have been listening and doing things differently, and they needed room to grow and change and give some grace for that growth and change to happen. But they never had a space where they could sit down and have these hard conversations. And then we kind of get to the point where we're then like, this was only just meeting one, which is like, what will we do moving forward? And afterwards, they each come up to me individually, and they're just like, oh my goodness, thank you. You know, they're like, you gave me this space to have this hard conversation. And that to me shows the power of what this work can really do. Fast forward, we're probably like a year and a half later since this, and we've been doing ongoing work on it. And I guarantee you these relationships have changed, right? But you have to be really intentional when you have those conversations. And it starts with understanding where you even come in when it comes to having trust from the beginning. So that's a little bit of a story example. And from that, I'm going to give you kind of what I see as really critical lessons through the deliberation dialogue work that I've done that I think is really relevant for any of us who are scientists, practitioners, boundary spanners, whatnot, which is, what does it mean to build trust? You have to recognize that we are very complex humans. We're very messy. We have all these biases. You just need to embrace that versus shy away from it. We have to have more room for humility in a lot of this work, and a lot of room for grace. We actually have to learn to disagree with respect. We're not trying to always change people's minds, right? Perhaps you just need to do a behavioral change sort of thing over there on the road to fix a problem. It's not necessarily trying to convince people what your worldview is. And most importantly, we often talk about what does it mean to be a good communicator? And communication is really important, but 10 times more important is to be a good and empathetic listener. And I'm not talking about listening to respond, listening to just feel identify the problem, but really listening for what people's values are. And it's a different type of listening. There's a person who I know, Naomi and Laura, and some of you all may know well. He's kind of, I consider him one of the sort of grandfathers at this point of community science, which is Raj Pandya. And he has a great little activity that I've stolen from him about how do you do empathetic, thoughtful listening. And I'll give a little tip for you, for those of you who are interested, is you pair off 2 people together, and you sit down and you have each person, you know, in 60 seconds to 2 minutes, share a story about something really good or an experience they had in the past couple weeks. And you, as the person who's sitting there kind of interviewing, listening to them, you're listening not for what the thing was that they shared, but what were their values were, right? This person was really valuing connection to family. This person was really valuing the hard work that they put in to get a promotion and a success. And they may have never said those words. And so it's this kind of deeper level of listening that I really encourage you to consider doing just in your day-to-day practice as much as you can. It takes a little bit different style, but it's listening for the words that are not being said. And that is where you can create really meaningful connection. So those are kind of my 3 takeaways of what I do to build trust. And I'll kind of stop there, and we've got maybe 10 minutes for any sort of questions you have. If not, I think between Laura, Naomi, and I, we could probably prompt you all with some questions, but I'll stop sharing.